September 1st, 1939. Wieland, Poland, 4:40 a.m. The town was sleeping when the sound began. It wasn't like aircraft engines. It was something else. A mechanical scream that made windows vibrate and bones ache. An inhuman wail that grew louder and louder until it filled the entire sky. People stumbled into the streets, confused and terrified, looking up at the pre-dawn darkness. They didn't understand what was happening. Then the bombs came. Wieland was a hospital town with no military value, but it was the first target of World War II, and it was chosen specifically to demonstrate a new kind of weapon. Not a bomb, not a gun, a sound. If you're a military historian or aviation veteran watching this, you already understand what made the Junkers U-87 Stuka different from every other aircraft of its era. For everyone else, pay attention, because what happened in the skies over Europe between 1939 and 1945 changed warfare forever. The Stuka proved that you could break soldiers before you ever dropped a bomb on them. You could shatter their will to fight with nothing but sound. Today, we're uncovering how Nazi Germany weaponized acoustics to create the most terrifying aircraft of the Second World War. This isn't about the bombs it carried. This is about the scream that came before them, the siren that turned grown men into shaking, vomiting wrecks who refused to leave their foxholes even after the attack had passed. The Stuka wasn't born with its scream. Early prototypes in 1935 were conventional dive bombers designed for precision strikes against ground targets. But something happened during field tests in 1936 during the Spanish Civil War. Luftwaffe observers noticed that Republican soldiers reacted with unusual panic when Stukas dove. The high-speed descent created a distinctive roar as air rushed over the aircraft's structure. Enemy troops would break and run even before bombs were released. German engineers saw an opportunity. If the natural sound of a diving aircraft caused fear, what if they amplified it? What if they turned it into a weapon? In 1937, they added a device that seemed almost absurdly simple: small wind-driven propellers mounted on the landing gear. As the Stuka dove at steep angles reaching speeds of 500 to 600 kilometers per hour, these propellers would spin in the airflow and produce a rising, falling wail. They called it the Jericho trumpet. The name wasn't accidental. The biblical walls of Jericho fell to the sound of trumpets. Nazi propagandists wanted their enemies to believe these sirens would bring the same destruction. The tactical thinking was clear. Blitzkrieg wasn't just about speed, it was about psychological collapse. Tanks, artillery, and aircraft coordinated to destroy not just armies, but the will to resist. The Stuka was the airborne component of this doctrine, and the Jericho siren was its primary weapon. But why did a simple sound have such devastating power over human beings? To understand that, we need to look at the science of acoustic warfare. The Jericho siren operated on principles that Nazi Germany had studied meticulously. The device consisted of metal propellers mounted on the fixed landing gear that rotated with airflow during the Stuka's signature 90-degree dive. As the aircraft accelerated to terminal velocity, the siren produced a rising shriek that peaked between 90 and 110 decibels. That's equivalent to a chainsaw operating inches from your ear. Military acoustic studies from the era showed that sounds above 85 decibels cause immediate physical discomfort. Above 100 decibels, the human body enters acute stress mode. Cortisol floods the bloodstream, adrenaline spikes. The sympathetic nervous system activates fight or flight responses. But it wasn't just the volume, it was the frequency and the pattern. The Jericho siren operated between 500 and 700 Hz. This is a range where human hearing is exceptionally sensitive. It's also dangerously close to frequencies associated with natural threats, the screams of predatory animals, the wailing of infants in distress. The human brain is hardwired over millions of years of evolution to respond to these frequencies with instinctive fear. More importantly, the sound modulated. It rose and fell in pitch as the aircraft accelerated and the propeller rotation speed changed. This created auditory uncertainty. The brain couldn't predict the pattern, couldn't anticipate when the sound would peak or end. This unpredictability maximized anxiety and prevented habituation. Veterans of the Polish campaign reported involuntary physical reactions. An officer from a Polish artillery unit described soldiers vomiting uncontrollably, trembling, and refusing to emerge from defensive positions even after Stuka formations had departed. British military medical documents from 1940 reference what they called Stuka siren fatigue among troops evacuated from Dunkirk, a form of acoustic trauma where the mere sound of aircraft engines could trigger panic attacks. The effect wasn't just individual, it was collective. When an entire unit heard the siren, fear spread through emotional contagion. Veterans described watching fellow soldiers freeze completely, unable to move even when they knew intellectually they should seek cover. The rational mind understood what was happening, but the primitive brain that controlled survival responses had taken over, and that brain was screaming one thing: run. Studies conducted by Allied medical officers showed physiological responses that soldiers couldn't control. Heart rates spiked to 140 to 160 beats per minute. Pupils dilated. Fine motor control deteriorated. Some men lost bowel and bladder control. These weren't signs of cowardice, they were involuntary responses to an acoustic assault on the nervous system. What made the Jericho siren particularly insidious was the time factor. The siren announced the attack 30 to 40 seconds before bombs fell. That interval was calculated, long enough for terror to build, long enough for panic to spread, but not long enough for soldiers to process their emotions and respond rationally. They had time to hear death coming, but not time to accept it. The theory was devastating, but the real-world execution transformed entire battlefields into acoustic nightmares. France, May 1940, the Battle of Sedan. The German blitzkrieg against France depended on a critical breakthrough point, crossing the Meuse River at Sedan. On May 13th and 14th, the Luftwaffe launched one of the largest Stuka operations of the war. For 8 continuous hours, wave after wave of U-87s dove on French defensive positions. The intervals between attacks were measured in minutes. As soon as one formation finished its run, another began. Veterans from French infantry divisions described psychological collapse. It wasn't the bombs that broke units, it was the anticipation. The scream announced that in 30 to 40 seconds high explosives would fall. That interval of pure terror was calculated. Soldiers had enough time to panic, but not enough time to master their fear. French military documents report that entire divisions abandoned prepared defensive positions before the first bombs even landed. Officers lost control of their troops. Some soldiers fired on their own men in confusion and panic. Others simply ran, not toward rear areas in any organized retreat, just away from the sound that promised death was coming. A captain from the 55th Infantry Division later described the scene in debriefing reports. His men had held their positions through artillery barrages, through tank attacks, but when the Stukas came, something broke. Experienced sergeants who had fought in World War I were found curled in foxholes, hands over their ears, unable to function. The unit ceased to exist as a fighting force, not because of casualties, but because of sound. The German breakthrough at Sedan succeeded partly because Stuka attacks shattered French morale along the entire defensive line. Troops who should have been fighting were instead hiding, fleeing, or frozen in terror. The acoustic weapon had achieved what conventional bombing might not have. Operation Barbarossa, June 1941, the Soviet Front. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union, Stukas were used not just against military positions, but deliberately against civilian refugee columns. The goal was to create chaos on roads and block Soviet military movement. The acoustic terror worked even more effectively against untrained civilian populations. Reports from NKVD archives document mass panic events where thousands of people crushed each other trying to escape the sound. Horses became uncontrollable, overturning carts and wagons. Children were separated from families in the chaos. The siren didn't just announce danger, it triggered stampedes. Soldiers from Soviet rifle divisions described a different kind of terror. Unlike Western European armies that had some warning about Stuka tactics, Soviet forces in 1941 encountered the siren with no preparation. The psychological shock was total. Units that should have maintained anti-aircraft fire instead scattered. Even political officers who would normally shoot deserters were found hiding alongside regular soldiers. Post-war tactical analyses revealed something remarkable. Stukas caused disproportionate psychological damage compared to their actual destructive capacity. A British intelligence study from 1943 estimated that the psychological effect of the siren multiplied the Stuka's tactical effectiveness by a factor of 3 to 5 against non-veteran units. Experienced troops who had survived multiple Stuka attacks showed reduced panic responses, but fresh units always broke. Allied forces attempted various countermeasures. Training programs included exposure to recorded Stuka siren sounds to reduce panic responses. Results were mixed. Hearing a recording in a safe training environment produced nothing like the visceral terror of the real thing diving at you with bombs armed. Some units were issued ear protection, but this proved impractical in active combat, where soldiers needed to hear commands and threats. The most effective countermeasure was increased anti-aircraft fire during Stuka dives, not because it shot down many aircraft, but because it gave defending troops something to do. Action reduced panic. Soldiers manning machine guns and firing at diving Stukas felt less helpless than those who could only take cover and wait. But nothing truly countered the psychological weapon. The only real defense was experience. Veterans who had survived their first Stuka attack, who had heard the siren and lived, developed partial tolerance. Their brains learned that the sound didn't always mean death. But that learning came at a brutal cost. Units had to be broken before they could be hardened. Then, everything changed. The Stuka was designed for one specific condition: total air superiority, clear skies with no enemy fighters. In Poland, France, and the early months of Barbarossa, the Luftwaffe controlled the airspace. Stukas could dive unmolested, but that dominance didn't last. The Battle of Britain in the summer of 1940 exposed a critical weakness. The Ju-87 was slow, with a maximum speed of just 410 kilometers per hour. It was not maneuverable, and it was vulnerable. RAF Spitfires and Hurricanes could destroy Stukas with terrifying efficiency. German losses were so catastrophic that Stukas were withdrawn from operations over Britain after just 2 weeks. The same pattern repeated on the Eastern Front once the Soviet Air Force rebuilt after catastrophic early losses. By 1942, Stukas operating in contested airspace were being shot down in large numbers. The aircraft that had terrorized ground troops became easy prey for enemy fighters. Here's where the story takes a dark turn. Declassified Luftwaffe documents from 1943 reveal that Stuka pilots requested permission to remove the Jericho sirens. The reason was tactical survival. The siren announced the Stuka's position to enemy fighters seconds before visual contact. The acoustic weapon that terrorized ground forces was killing aircrew by advertising their approach to armed opponents. The high command refused. Joseph Goebbels and a Nazi propaganda machine had transformed the Jericho siren into an iconic symbol of German air power and invincibility. Removing it would be admitting weakness. So pilots continued flying combat missions with a device that literally announced their arrival to enemies with guns. The irony is brutal. The weapon designed to break enemy morale became a liability that killed its own operators. But propaganda value outweighed pilot survival in Nazi military calculus. There's another twist that emerged from post-war research. By late 1943 and 1944, veteran Allied troops had developed what psychologists call response reversal. The sound that once caused paralytic fear now triggered a different reaction: excitement. Veteran soldiers had learned that stupas were vulnerable, slow-moving, and valuable targets. The scream that once announced terror now signaled opportunity. Allied after-action reports from Italy and France in 1944 described soldiers cheering when they heard Stuka sirens, rushing to man anti-aircraft weapons rather than taking cover. The psychological weapon had inverted. It had become a dinner bell announcing prey. By the final year of the war, Stukas were relegated to night operations, anti-partisan missions, and secondary fronts where the siren didn't matter because there were no organized troops to terrorize. The reign of acoustic terror had ended. But its legacy didn't die in 1945. The principles behind the Jericho siren echo through modern warfare in surprising ways. Iraq and Afghanistan, 2003 to 2021. Coalition forces used unmanned aerial vehicles equipped with speakers, broadcasting propaganda messages and intimidating sounds over insurgent-controlled areas. While officially psychological operations, veterans report that the constant sound of drones circling 24 hours a day caused severe psychological fatigue in civilian populations. The effect wasn't fundamentally different from the Stuka siren: inescapable mechanical sound announcing potential death. Syria, 2015 to present. Russian Su-25 ground attack aircraft have been documented using deliberately loud dive attacks on urban areas. Acoustic analysis shows engine noise during attack dives reaching 95 to 105 decibels. Video footage of Syrian civilians shows reactions nearly identical to those described in World War II. Paralysis, panic, chaotic flight. Ukraine, 2022 to present. Iranian Shahed-136 kamikaze drones used by Russian forces produce a distinctive flying motorcycle sound. Survivor accounts from Ukrainian cities describe the terror of hearing that sound approach, knowing the explosion will follow. The principle is identical: sound as inescapable herald of destruction. Modern military technology has evolved the concept. Long-range acoustic devices produce painful high-frequency sounds at 120 to 150 decibels for crowd control. Research into infrasound weapons explores frequencies below human hearing that cause nausea, disorientation, and anxiety without conscious awareness. Modern artillery munitions are designed to whistle deliberately during flight. The lesson of the Jericho siren endures. War isn't just physical destruction, it's destruction of the will to resist. Soldiers can be trained to face bullets and bombs, but the human brain has acoustic vulnerabilities that predate civilization. Sounds that activate primal fear, frequencies associated with danger, unpredictable patterns, extreme volume can break even the most disciplined troops. World War II veterans carried the sound of the Stuka siren for decades. Many reported in interviews conducted in the 1980s and 1990s that they still felt anxiety when hearing modulated high-pitched sounds, emergency vehicle sirens, alarm clocks, even children's toys. The acoustic trauma was real, measurable, and permanent. Understanding this history matters because acoustic warfare never stopped, it evolved. The frequencies changed, the delivery systems modernized, but the fundamental truth remains. Sound can be as lethal as explosives, not because it destroys bodies, because it destroys minds. If you are a veteran who experienced Stuka attacks or any form of acoustic warfare, share your story in the comments below. Your experiences help others understand what war really means. If you found this valuable, like and share this video. Subscribe for more documented war history that goes beyond textbooks. We're committed to telling the real stories, backed by real sources. Thanks for watching.